Alrighty, this is my rant for the day. This is under the title of Making Believe and I again am Jonathan Albin, a game master with more than 50 years of experience, or very nearly 50 years of experience. And we're going to talk today about why the very concept of hit points just stinks. There are things that can be done to make an adventure game more challenging, more fun, more dynamic, more realistic, and so on. And we're going to go into all of those. But these are my primary points on why I feel that the concept of hit points kind of stinks. So let's start way back in the past, and let's start with the fact that hit points aren't real. If you hadn't noticed, there's no place on a human being's body where there's a big mark that says HP and a little tank that you can see how many points you have left. There's nothing like that. As a matter of fact, the very concept of tracking hit points is not in any way realistic as far as the mechanism of play. Pardon me a second. I guess I won't. All right. But hit points do not catch anything about reality. For example, one of the things that hit points sort of are to represent is your character's advancement, and as the character becomes more advanced in the story, and it doesn't really matter which kind of role-play system you're using, nearly all of them use some kind of pool or tracking mechanism for a static number of points that simply improves and increases over time. And the only thing I can tell you about humanity that increases over time is the weight, the distribution around your center. You tend to gain inches and pounds over time, but I don't think that's what hit points are meant to be. As a matter of fact, the idea of a massive hit point pool leads to serious problems within the game mechanics. They tend to bloat combat scenes. In other words, I guess there's some advantage of saying that a more skilled warrior will take longer to defeat an opponent against an equitably defensed individual. So two better warriors will take longer than two lesser warriors. But isn't that also going to be sort of an abstract, because a more competent warrior will gauge and scale himself for the fight in order to stay longer, and therefore the very concept of having a large pool of hit points, I can't tell you how many times I've actually heard it quoted in a game that, oh well, we can take this monster because I've got enough hit points, even if I lose every round, we can kill it. And they also, because of the fact that they bloat the combat scenes, they tend to eat up an inordinate amount of playtime. I get that we want to have an engagement that feels a little bit of give and take and a little bit of up and down in the dynamics, but a hit point pool really doesn't do that, because it's simply a drain, literally just a plug that drains out a certain life force by each attack, and it just completely bloats out the combat sequence and makes the scenes not even tenable. Ultimately, they're obsolete. Anybody who's watched the great sword fighting movies of the past, I can see in those how you might do that. For example, if you look at a movie like Scaramouche or The Three Musketeers, the great fight scenes do tend to take much longer as they battle back and forth across terrain and jumps and swings, and scene from The Princess Bride. But reality, that sort of fighting style, even in motion pictures, is pretty much gone by modern times. So the hit point mechanism is not tenable or useful in modern era because of one of the critical points, and we'll get to that here in a second. They do tend to prevent realistic options, because all you're doing is you're looking at your hit point pool, looking at your opponent's potential hit point pool, taking into account the success failure rate you're having in a fight scene, and just keep slogging pound, and it prevents realistic options like running away or fainting or giving ground, taking ground, etc., etc. There's no mechanically, there's nothing about the hit point pool that actually aids or improves roleplay at all. It basically prevents the player from choosing actions that may be more realistic. After the fifth or sixth round of combat, you will be reaching levels of physical fatigue. But given the radical modifiers that a high level character has, he can pretty much ignore the negatives of fatigue. But really, the most point, we're going to come to the center point of this section, and that is that they are a relic from the 1960s. The very concept of hit points was started at the end of World War II and into Vietnam, Korea, and other conflicts. But it was the realization that came after World War II that you could model a combat system whereby you don't actually attack the opponent's military capability. You don't have to fight their warrior versus warrior. There's no longer the samurai who rides out in front to the challenges. There's none of that. Instead, you can resolve conflict by determining what war fighting capability the enemy has and deprive them of the critical elements to do that war fighting. So World War II was by and large won by eliminating the fuel depots, the rubber plants, the machining shops and such that were required to build the engines of war. And so therefore the modelers of World War II and modelers of conflicts thereafter soon developed what was considered to be the logistics pool. It was that portion of a game's identifiable forces and their ability to maintain their warfighting footing. So this would be a box that was marked supply lines or a box that was marked resources or whatever. And each round that you were able to whittle away at those resources, you took away more of the enemy's ability to hold its position and maintain its attack. And so that concept was then translated because with the advent of Dungeons and Dragons, it actually grew out of the conflict games, conflict resolution, war games of its time, and it focused on that kind of conflict, and yet the players were interested in what happens with an individual. And so it was a logical conclusion to call it an amorphous pool of hit points. And yes, let it advance over time because it represented that you had more resource, better supply lines, etc. But in gameplay, it didn't make any mechanical sense. It just didn't. And players had to realize that the conflict wasn't even realistic. The very idea that I roll a dice, meaning I swing my sword, is not realistic except in game mechanics. And that makes it fundamentally an ancient relic. Now, the irony is that most of the board games and war games and even video games of today's world still use this basic concept in their development. You have a hit point track, and as time goes by, that hit point track gets bigger and bigger or larger and larger in terms of volume, and therefore your survivability continues to extend further and further. Now, of course, in a balanced game, there will also be an increased number of points that are being able to be removed by villainous attacks and magic effects and such. So there is an attempt to balance it, and yet it's still being built on this 1960s technology. And there have been a few elemental systems that have come out over time that have tried to avoid this or get past it. But for the most part, these all have held to hit points because it's what players have become familiar with, and it's assumed, therefore, that this is the only way to deal with the conflict. The problem with it is that hit points create false conditions. I mean, the very idea, there's a very interesting scene in the movie The Gamers by The Gentleman Productions, wherein a rogue is attempting to cross an area that he happens to know is trapped, and he's making his checks and he keeps failing and getting blown up, keeps failing and getting blown up. And finally, the warrior of the group says, "Why don't you just let me do it? I've got more hit points." And so he just walked right in, takes all the damage in one shot, and doesn't phase him. He has enough hit points. So it creates these falsified conditions that actually deprive the players of some of the much desired realism in a role-play game. Other options, as I mentioned before, is other places where this happens, for example, are when you're going into a conflict. You count the number of enemies, the number of hit points they can have, do the calculation, say, yeah, I can stand here all day. Even though the very idea of being overwhelmed, overtaken, and such should find elements of that, there's no mechanism in roleplay games as written that lets you emulate the reality of it. You have to force the reality if you want to have it. Otherwise, it just simply is not going to be occurring in that session. Furthermore, hit points tend to undermine roleplay. In other words, if you have a obviously defending guard and the players are trying to be stealthy, it could be a good roleplay environment for them to go up and try to talk their way past the guard, or at least distract him enough that they can get behind him or whatever, and create a decent roleplay environment. But instead, because they know they've got the hit points for it, they just walk up and pound the guy in the sand. Even if he screams, it doesn't matter to them because they've got the hit points to overcome it. So it completely undermines the very mechanism of roleplay. Why do a roleplay of the scene when you can just simply avoid it by whacking the guy? So not only that, hit points tend to promote extremes. The idea is that you are trying to build a persona and you are using certain mechanisms within the game to improve your life points over time, because that way you get the larger pool and therefore you can pull shenanigans and do actions in the game that are extremely silly. But more important, they promote the extremes of saying when you go into a fight with an opponent, you're not even going to think about rolling to overcome them. There's actually in Dungeons & Dragons originally there was no actual rules, no rules for that you fought until the opponent was dead and eliminated. And in that case, it was because they already had games before that they'd been playing, the very games that propagated Dungeons & Dragons, where they had persona survive the fight and just have a reduced morale or whatever. And they were wanting to get to the point of conclusion. So it originally fomented and promoted extremes like that. And the problem with that, of course, is that it makes the game mechanic feel abrupt, sharp, and unrealistic. There are plenty of memes out there I could point to that show how ridiculous a player can react when they have an exceedingly large number of HPs late in game, and how they can abuse their position in the story. Pardon me. Hit points also are an unfair measure of worth. The idea of gaining more and more and more hit points doesn't mean that you are a better and better role player. As a matter of fact, it's got very little to do with role playing, because HPs are involved in the combat system, and the combat system is not role play. Now, certain game masters are clever enough to cause it to be so by using narrative descriptions of the fights, but that's totally a benefit of having that storyteller or game master. It's not a factor of the game mechanics, and so it really is an unfair measure of a player's value or worth in the games group, simply because he's got more points than anyone else in that one particular category. And ultimately, hit points completely kill storytelling. And by this, I mean, this actually goes back to several of the points we made earlier. Because it bloats combat, the hit points bloat combat, they make the game take longer to accomplish. Even if it's an obvious inevitability, having to play out round after round of conflict because of the game mechanics actually actively destroys roleplay, because it gives you less time to do so. The mechanism is obsolete and difficult to interpret, so the storyteller has to embellish and amplify the effects of actions in the game by interpreting die rolls in such a way that there's no room left for role play, and there's no possible way that a persona in a game can actually choose an action that isn't ultimately trying to delete the opponent's hit points. And this, therefore, puts us in a position where the storytelling of the game master and the players together is hindered almost to the point of not being useless. Now, useful. I know several situations in my life where game players were dissatisfied because the game mechanics were what they really liked. They appreciated that, and they would actually. And in one case, a group actually asked me to run a Nycos campaign with 100% licensed Nycos. They didn't want to hear the stories. They didn't want to engage with the NPCs. They simply wanted to roll dice, kick down doors, kill monsters, and take their stuff. And that, of course, is an unfortunate thing. So in all of these reasons, the very concept of hit points kind of stink. And so if you want to hear more about alternatives, I did do a video here on roleplay and the NycosRPG mechanism. So we'll get back to that in a little bit later, but I want to thank you for continuing to watch us. This is Making Believe. I'm your host, Jonathan Alvin, and we are going to be moving on to our next section of the show here in a moment. I want to thank you for being here. If you haven't yet, make sure you follow the channel so you can keep track of what's coming up in terms of new videos, and also check out our YouTube channel at NycosRPG for backup copies of all of the videos that we've done thus far, as well as some interesting videos that are being set up uniquely to promote what we're going to be coming up with next.